Welcome to the wonderful world of wine, exploring all things wine with you. We are your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lenzi, and you can find us on all social media at The Wonderful World of Wine. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the wonderful world of wine, exploring trending topics in the wine world and speaking to interesting people in the wine world as well. I'm here with my co-host, Mark. How are you today, Mark?
Everything is great, Kim, and yourself?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm excited to speak to our special guest today. Her name is Sandra Taylor, and she is both an author as well as a sustainable business expert. So it is wonderful to have you on the show with us today, Sandra. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing great. Happy to
Wonderful.
be here.
So, Mark loves to find folks that we can have conversations with who are from various corners of involvement in the wine world, and especially folks who have written books and have varying, I would say, different interests in wine just in general. We've got winemakers, we've got wine writers, and you have a little bit of I think, different experience with wine than really anybody else that we've spoken to before on the show. So if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and telling our listeners a little bit about your involvement in wine.
Thank you. You're right. I am different. So I'm not a winemaker.
It's good to be different.
I fell in love with wine. My very first job, I went to law school in Boston, as a matter of fact. And right after my very first job was as a diplomat. And I had an opportunity to live in Europe, in Geneva. And on the weekends, I went to France and Italy with my European colleagues for fun. And that's when I fell in love with wine. It was many years before I actually devoted myself 100% to wine, but I studied it. So I guess I'm self-studied in wine, although I eventually did an MBA, a wine MBA, which is a little bit unusual. I'm happy to tell you a bit more about that. But I basically started my journey, I guess, toward wine, working in the coffee industry. Eventually, after many iterations, my career, I ended up working for Starbucks as the chief sustainability officer and learned a lot about coffee and discovered a lot of similarities between making coffee and growing and making wine. So that's kind of how I made my way into wine. I fell in love with wine early on, but eventually I found an opportunity to pursue my passion for wine and my knowledge of sustainable agriculture.
And I want to thank you, Sandra. First off, your book, Vines and Values, A Consumer's Guide to Sustainable Wine. I want to thank you for the book. I want to thank you for your passion in promoting and educating on sustainability in the wine world. And this is something years ago I heard about sustainability, and I took the California Sustainability Ambassador program. It opened my eyes up. And I know you stated that consumer education is often at the bottom of people's list, yet 93% of Americans say that sustainability is important, and 10% say they will pay more for a sustainable product. So can you start out by giving a summary of what is sustainability in wine and why does it matter?
Yeah, it matters to consumers, but it also matters to the wine industry. I mean, the wine industry is very concerned about climate change. Grapes are very sensitive to temperature. So there's been lots of great research done on the fact that areas that are currently prime for growing grapes and growing vineyards for specific grapes may not be hospitable to vineyards in the future. So the industry is very concerned about climate change and energy issues. So I think consumers in general are becoming more concerned about all the products that they buy. How are the workers treated? For food products, how will they treat me? Are they good for me health-wise? Are they good for the environment where they were grown? So I think it's not just wine, but wine, I think, is a fun way to help consumers understand sustainability. It turns out that there are are a lot of different areas that we kind of lump a lot of areas under the heading of sustainability. So there's organically grown wine, and probably that's the area that consumers feel most knowledgeable because they purchase organic products in the grocery store. They buy organic broccoli and greens and organic fruit. And so they understand that organic means no chemicals. Sustainable is a bit different. So I think people want to know what went into the products that I put into my body, and wine is certainly one of those products.
You mentioned a lot. It gives me so many questions, Sandra. First off, you mentioned in your book, you talk about comparing sustainability versus conventional growing and winemaking and the use of chemicals to produce a consistent product on the market. But can you talk about additives? Say a winery uses additives or something like Velcrin. Can they still be considered sustainable in the wine world?
I don't think so. Not to me, they aren't. And certainly there are wine regions that have certifications. And so chemicals, they're very concerned about certain chemicals and additives being used in these products. And there are inspectors who go and visit with wineries and assess the kind of chemicals that are used. Now, it's very important for me to say that chemicals are permitted in sustainable wine. But the question is how much? And in many of the certification programs, and I'm happy to go into a lot more detail about that, but in many certification programs, there's no prohibition against using certain chemicals, but winemakers and vineyard managers have to document when they spray, how much they spray, how often they spray. In some places, people say, oh, well, my grandfather always sprayed 10 times during the harvest season, but maybe it isn't necessary to spray that often. And so sustainability is a way to start to regulate how often chemicals are used and what kind of chemicals are used. In some regions, they banned certain chemicals. In most certification programs, there are specific chemicals that are banned. However, I make a distinction between kind of artisanal and conventional. A lot of conventional wines are produced so that they taste the same and look the same whenever you buy them. And people become accustomed to that, just like their favorite burger, right? They know how it's going to taste and they want it to taste that way. But often to get the wine to look that way and taste that way requires additives. Now, when you talk about artisanal wines, those wines, let's say Bordeaux or even some parts of California, the weather may change from one year to the next, and that influences the amount of sugar that has developed in the grape. It may influence the color. And those artisanal winemakers are not using additives to produce a wine that looks the same and maybe tastes the same from one year to the next. And collectors really enjoy that. We want to know, what happened. The weather was different from one year to the next. How did that influence the flavor of the wine? So artisanal wines are produced without those additives. Conventional wines, which tend to be a little bit less expensive, are often produced in ways that consumers say, oh, I know that wine. I know what it tastes like. I know what it looks like. That's the one I like. And then sustainable goes even further because often in some certification programs in, say, California or in Oregon or in New Zealand, there are certain chemicals that are prohibited. And I won't list those because it varies from one region to the next. But some chemicals are prohibited. You can't use those at all. And when you do use chemicals, you have to spray and document for the inspector so they know exactly what kinds of chemicals you've used in your product.
That's such a succinct way of putting it. And I know that as a teacher of wine classes, sometimes it's difficult to try to differentiate for my students what qualifies as kind of a commercial kind of brand where the producers are looking to make this consistent product from year in and year out versus the more artisanal product. And it really kind of hammers home the fact that wine drinkers are not all homogenous. There's wine drinkers who some are looking for, like you said, something that's different every vintage, and they're collectors. You're interested in what makes them different from year to year. But then there are other wine consumers who want that consistency. So I think the fact that producers producers of different styles of wine, different types of wine, recognize that there are different consumers out there really does lead into this whole conversation about additives, sustainability, because it is important to recognize that there are different types of people who are drinking wine.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think increasingly there are people who want sustainable wines. There
Sure.
are people who want organic wines. And that many, many years ago, organic wine didn't taste so good. And
Mm,
unfortunately, it has a bad reputation as a result. And that's because those wines didn't have a long shelf life.
hmm
They were drunk within a few months or a year of or two of making the wine. It tasted good if it sat on the shelf a little bit too long because they were not permitted to add certain sulfites, for example. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but
Yeah, we won't get into the sulfite conversation on this one.
but there are things that would preserve the wine. And I think the winemaking has become much more sophisticated
Uh-huh.
since those days. And you do find organic wines that taste very good. I like all kinds of wine. I tend to buy wines that are certified sustainable, but not all wines. Some wines are sustainable without certification.
Uh-huh.
Some winemakers don't want to go through that process or spend the money on being certified. But there are a lot of wines that are artisanal and sustainable that I think are very good.
Mark teaches a class on reading wine labels, and he calls it, what is it?
Truths
Truth
and
and lies on your
lies.
wine label, something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And what you just said about there are certain producers that are trying to follow these practices, but they don't necessarily go through these certifications. That is one of those difficult things for consumers about reading a wine label and trying to figure out, am I getting one of these handmade, artisanal, the winemaker, great grape growers trying to do the best that they can, or are you getting one of these big brand things? So it's hard from a consumer perspective.
Yeah, and many of the regions, it's regional
Hmm
certifications. Many of the regions now permit wines to indicate on their label and the governments, because, the governments around the world regulate what can go on wine labels. It's not simply up to the winery to do that.
It's never simple, is it?
It's never that simple. But even governments permit wineries to indicate on the label that they are certified, New York certification program or new certified wines, New Zealand, same of
Mm.
Australia or Argentina. There are these regional certification programs all over now, which is great. It's very exciting, I think. And so winery lovers and wine consumers can sometimes find on the label an indication that the wine is sustainable, or they can use their phone to look up a wine's website while they're shopping at a store. But it's so much easier when it's on the label.
I think that's one of the things that's probably confusing to people in the wine world and probably listeners today listening. We're talking about certification, sustainability. And you noted in your book, you have a whole appendix of all these different certifications and all these different labels you can see on a wine. And I think Kim and I did a whole show on certifications. It
Mhm.
doesn't necessarily mean they're all sustainable, but they care about something. It could be salmon, it could be anything, organically grown or certified organic. And
Waterways,
yeah,
things
you
like that.
highlight all that in the book to bring awareness to take some initiative to see what you're drinking and what the winery is doing. They probably have one of these certifications. Often, as a wine buyer, people approach me with a wine and they say, well, they're sustainable, they're organic, but it's not on the label because they don't, like you said, they don't want to pay for it.
Yeah.
Or and you don't know, do I believe them when they're trying to
Yeah.
sell me the wine? So I'm assuming consumers are the same way, Sandra. They see a wine, they might hear it's sustainable without seeing it on that label. It's confusing, I think, to
Yeah.
wine buyers.
Yeah, and if it's not certified, I mean, I know of wines that are produced in a very responsible and sustainable way that don't have any indication on their label. I live in Virginia. There is no certification program for Virginia wine, but I know of some wines that are sustainably produced. So it is confusing. I mean, I wish I could say that just rely on the certifications because increasingly there are many regions around the world that have certifications certifications, but I don't want to exclude some of those wines that are doing the responsible thing and producing good wines. It just requires some research, I think, but it's easy if the wine is already certified sustainable and if that government permits the wineries to put that on the label.
And you highlight a lot of wineries in your book, suggestions of wineries and wines that you know have certain certifications or certain levels of sustainability. I hear off maybe due to climate change, but a lot of artisanal winemakers will say, I'm practicing organic or I'm trying to be sustainable, but this happened, so I couldn't do that. So I've not gone for the certification or I had to get off the certification. Are you seeing more of that due to the climate changes?
I don't know that it's necessarily due to climate change, but for example, to become organic, it takes several years of organic operations before you can actually be certified. Imagine a vineyard where there's been chemicals used in the vineyard for years. It takes a long time for the soil, for all of those chemicals to leave the soil or no longer influence the vine that's grown in that soil. So it can take years, 3 to 7 years sometimes, for a winery that wants to be certified organic to get organic certification. So that's one example. Another example could just be weather. In one year, there could be weather challenges that require a vineyard manager to spray certain chemicals because of the weather, or certain pests, bugs that affect the vineyard. And so there could be lots of reasons why in a particular area or year they are not able to abide by or move toward their organic certification, for example. And the same could be true for sustainable. So yeah, there are lots of reasons why it's more difficult. I think one good thing, though, is that a lot of the chemical manufacturers are starting to produce products that address the concerns and needs of sustainable vineyards. And I think that's wonderful. I mean, I have attended, for example, in California, the Unified Wine and Grape Symposium, which happens every year. It's huge, huge trade show. And there are manufacturers of chemicals who are there showing how sometimes one drop of a chemical on a leaf will have the kind of impact on the full vine that the vineyard manager wants and needs. So it's not always necessary to spray every part of the vine and spray several times a year to get the impact that's needed. And that just takes time and effort. But I think as the industry becomes more sustainable, their suppliers are providing more sustainable products as well.
You're listening to The Wonderful World of Wine, and we are your hosts, Mark Lenzi and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. Our program is supported by Franklin Public Radio. You can find us on our website, thewww.wine. You can find us on all social media at The Wonderful World of Wine. Today, our special guest is Sandra Taylor. Sandra is the author of the book Vines and Values, A Consumer's Guide to Sustainable Wine. You can find her on her website, sandraetaylor.com. Welcome back. We're talking with Sandra Taylor, talking sustainability in wine and things to look for on labels. And Sandra, you talking about organic wine and certifications. And I learned something in your book about the comparison of certified organic wine versus organic grapes being used. And there's actually a percentage that surprised me where I believe organically grown, or it says made with organic grapes, can be 70% of the grapes have to be organic, and certified organic has to be 95% organic grapes, correct?
That's correct. And that depends on governments, various governments.
So typically,
that's a U.S. government.
That kind of, I always thought, so it still means there could be some conventional stuff going on with that other 30% and that other 5% in those wines, correct?
Yes, and those are called wine grown with organic grapes. It's not certified certified organic wine. And that's true in the US and in Europe. And in the EU, they have different rules than we do in the United States, just to make it even more
Right. Right.
complicated.
More complicated.
It is a complicated system for consumers, and I know that I have answered multiple questions from people about, is this wine organic? And then one has to go into more of an explanation about what you just said of organically grown grapes versus organic wines. I don't know if you want to spend a minute explaining to our listeners, at least from the perspective of American-made wines, what the difference between the two might be.
Well, organically grown grapes are grown in the vineyard without chemicals. That's pretty simple, right? The grapes are grown in the vineyard without chemicals. Then there's a harvest. The grapes are picked, they're fermented, they're gone into the winery for making into the wine. And there might be some chemicals that are used in the wine making process. Many producers prefer to sell wines that are made with organically grown grapes. In the European Union, that wine, even if it's made with organic grapes but not made in the vineyard, in the winery, sorry, without chemicals, can still be labeled organic wines. And then there's the amount of sulfites per million, and it gets much more complicated. And I think that's why many regions now are opting for sustainable certification versus organic certification. It's easier. It depends on the region, and these certifications are done by the industry. They develop the standards for what chemicals should not be used, and then they develop the standards for what can be certified sustainable.
Oh, so interesting. So it comes from the industry as opposed to coming from the government to be the one who is certifying that your grapes or your winemaking is organic.
Well, no,
No?
organic versus, so organic is a government certification. So in the US, it's the US Department of Agriculture that sets the standards for what is organic, not just for wine or grape.
Right. For anything. Could be carrots. Could
That's
be blueberries.
correct. Yeah. And that's the same in Japan, in Canada, in the European Union. It's a European Union body that sets the standards for what is organic. But sustainable is done within regions. So, for example, Argentina, I think it's the newest of the sustainable certifications, and that's done by an industry body that gets together and decides this is what is required in the vineyard to be sustainably grown grapes, and this is what is required in the winery to be sustainably grown grapes. And that varies. In Napa, for example, they've outlawed Roundup. They don't, that's not permitted. Glyphosate is not permitted. That may not be the case in some other part of the world. In South Africa, they have different standards. So it is done by the sustainability certification is done by the industry and industry body.
What are some of the factors that go into someone being certified sustainable? I know Lodi is big on it. Sonoma is big on it in the U.S. What are some of the things our listeners need to know when they see something is certified sustainable? What do these wineries care about, or what are they doing?
They are, well, simply put, in almost there's Lodi, there's Sonoma, there's Italy has a program. I mentioned Argentina. They all are reducing the amount of spraying in the vineyard. So it all starts in the vineyard. They're reducing the amount of spraying. They are also conserving water. There are standards for water conservation. There are standards for how workers are treated. So all of those things become part of sustainable certification. And it varies from one region to the next because conditions vary from one region to the next. In Chile, for example, it's a very dry climate. They don't have the same kind of pests you might find in Italy, for example. And so the industry gets together and says, well, this particular chemical is the least harmful chemical for dealing with the pests that we have to deal with in our vineyard. And so that might vary from one part of the world to the next. So there's no single certification that applies globally.
How did this whole sustainable certification project get started? as far as different wine regions of the world. It seems like it's a global goal to bring about this more sustainable way of achieving winemaking and
Yeah.
grape growing.
Well, I chuckle because it's debated whether it started in Lodi, California, or New Zealand. In New
Ah,
Zealand,
gotcha.
they say they started it. In
Oh,
Lodi, they said they started it.
this
And
is the
Lodi,
age-old question, right? It's like,
yeah,
where's wine from?
exactly.
They'll argue about that.
Yeah. So I think Lodi, let's assume for a conversation that it started in Lodi. And I think, and interestingly, it often has started with growers. So the growers think about the people who are in the vineyards every day or, every other day, tending to the vines. They don't want to be exposed to certain chemicals.
Right.
And so I think in most instances in Lodi and in New Zealand, for example, the growers decided we really want to reduce the level of chemicals that's required to produce a high quality harvest. And then they persuaded their customers, the wineries, that they maybe had to pay a little more. Maybe it cost them a little bit more to spend more time in the vineyard than just spraying. Just to go and make sure to look and see what's needed today or this week versus just assuming that they had to spray every other week during the growing season.
Hmm.
So once they decided that was the way, then they persuaded their customers, the wineries, to purchase maybe a few cents more per ton or of grapes.
So, Sandra, sustainability also has a lot to do with packaging and reducing emissions for waste. There's a lot of big glass bottles on the market and a lot of excessive capsule packaging being out there on the people see. What are your thoughts on adapting to like paper bottles, no capsules? Does that change to support sustainability hurt the romance of wine?
I don't believe that it does, but I must say that a lot of people are persuaded that a heavier bottle means a better quality
Hmm.
wine. And that's just not the case. So a sparkling wine requires a different type of bottle and a different weight of bottle because of all the effervescence inside the bottle, and it has to be strong to contain that. But typically, wine does not need to be in a very heavy bottle. Heavy bottles are more expensive to produce, more energy is used to produce glass bottles, and they're more expensive to transport. When you think about shipping a case of wine in very heavy bottles, it costs more in terms of energy use. So there's a real effort underway, I'm sure you're aware, of marketing wine in lighter weight bottles. A lot of research has been done that bottles don't break if they're lighter weight. So there's a lot of energy that's saved both in the production of the wine bottle and in the transport of the wine bottle. And there's even efforts to reduce the weight of champagne bottles. But, a lot of
Hmm.
experimentation to make sure that it's the right size and the right weight to contain champagne or sparkling wine. Now, it's hotly debated whether or not wine should be put in cans. And I've experimented. Lots of people experiment and they say, well, it doesn't taste any different. We went on a picnic, we had wine in cans and it was very good. Or, I'm a biker or hiker and I want to take wine with me in my backpack, and wine in cans works very well. I think people have a romantic notion about wine, certainly about sparkling wine, when they hear that pop.
Ugh,
But
the pop.
yeah, but there's a lot of things that are part of packaging that are just part of the romance of wine and are not at all required. The foil around the neck of the bottle is not required, but it's part of what we have come to expect. And of course, for many wineries, that means less costs, right? Because they can reduce some of what goes on the packaging. And then there are wineries that are very committed to sustainability, and it's personal. It's sometimes the owners, and even the labels are recycled paper, or they store their wines. They ship them in recycled cardboard boxes, that sort of thing. There's a lot of innovation that's happening in packaging, some of which is is very good for a climate strategy, to deal with some of our climate challenges. And I believe in box wines. I'm a big proponent of box wines, and fortunately, there are a few producers, high quality producers, who are now putting wine in boxes.
I'm so glad this is part of the sustainability conversation because I've been tasting wines with people from different parts of the world recently. And I was having a conversation with a winemaker from South Africa, and we were doing a presentation, and somebody in the audience wanted to know because he brought up the idea of wine in cans and that a couple of his products are available in cans, but only in South Africa. And they were like, why can't we get them here? So it seems like that there is this new kind of understanding and acceptance from the American market that you can be doing these things with unconventional packaging, shall we say, that doesn't necessarily detract from the quality of the wine. But if people are looking for them and they understand that this makes the wine better for the environment and it's still going to taste the same for you, then let's go for it.
Absolutely. And box wine is
Yeah.
one of those.
And it's taken so long for box wine to like shake its reputation as crummy wine. And I hope that very soon we have more of an understanding in the market that this is a good direction that we could be going in as far as packaging goes.
Yeah. I mean, I have had friends say in Europe, you find a box in every kitchen.
Yeah.
Because
and certainly in those little grocery stores in France and in Italy, they sell wine in boxes all over the place.
Yeah. And the wine lasts longer because
Yeah.
it's not exposed to oxygen. But I think part of the challenge has been certainly in the US, the United States, the wine, high-end producers have not put their wine, even some European, I know of a couple of European producers who were who ship wine in bottles to Scandinavia, to Sweden, another market that's very sensitive to sustainability and climate change. And these producers, the distributors are trying to persuade them to put their wine in boxes because they like that in Sweden. And these producers were like, no, because, we don't, this is high quality wine. And they finally did it. And the wine just sold like hotcakes. Because the consumer market there recognizes the importance of box wines, and they're just much more educated and sensitive around environmental issues than we are in the United States.
That's so interesting. Again, it kind of comes back to this understanding your market, and then it's not just one type of person who's drinking wine. And then if you are looking at it across so many different countries across the world, there's no one standard.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And so now there are a few high quality wine producers in the US that are producing or packaging their wines, some of their wines in boxes as well as bottles, but it's available, which is great, I think.
So, Sandra, we have to talk about in the book, you highlight the Wine Watch rating system, which is a 5 pillars of wine. That's a 50-point scale. Can you explain that to our listeners? It's something to look for and how to find.
Yeah, it's something I created. I know how much people rely on ratings. They go to Costco or any wine shop and it says, "Oh, this wine has a 90-point rating," and that from Jancis Robinson or some other wine critic, and it tells them something about the wine. To me, it's very subjective. It tells me that Jancis Robinson really likes this wine and believes that this wine will age. I would like to see, and what I am proposing, and it's not on the market yet, but we're almost there, is an app for rating wines according to their sustainability attributes. And so Wine Watch Watch is an acronym for practices in the winery, agricultural practices, meaning viticulture in the vineyard, transportation. I talked a little bit about the cost of energy and transportation. C is for certification and H is for humanity. So we have developed points for each of those. Many of the wineries that are featured in the book have already completed surveys praise. I did not include their wine watch rating because I really want people to adopt this program. I want to give consumers the opportunity to determine the level of sustainability of a wine based on its wine watch score. And I have a committee. It's not just my opinion, a committee of people who are helping us determine what should be the score. I'm working with a couple people in Silicon Valley actually on the app because I'm not a technology expert by any means. But I think it's going to be really a game changer for sustainable wines. I've walked through shops and listened to, eavesdropped on shoppers, and I'll hear them say, oh, this wine is from Chile. I think that's sustainable. I think I read somewhere that's sustainable. I want to be, if it's not on the label, I want them to be able to find the Wine Watch score. And I want to create an app. We are creating an app so that they can look on their phone and determine what is the Wine Watch score if they want to shop based on the sustainability attributes of the wine.
Oh, it's a great idea. I try everything as shelf talk as I put sustainable, fair trade, organic, biodynamic, whatever. And I could see that being a valuable resource because your rating would basically tell them. You're asking them if they're organic, if they're biodynamic in the survey, I would assume. That's all part of
Oh,
it, correct?
yeah. And I'm asking them what are their sustainability practices? Perhaps they are not certified, but my job and the job of our committee to determine which wines are actually sustainable, even if they're not certified. I think that we should provide that to consumers.
And that's for each wine, each vintage, not
It's
the
for
winery as a whole, or?
It's for the winery as a whole because
Okay.
wineries, you wouldn't find a winery that has one wine that's biodynamic and the others are not,
Yeah,
or
right.
one wine it's a winery itself that's
Okay.
certified. Yeah.
Okay, great. Great.
So, when I published a book, I actually listed wines by flavor because I just feel it's important to give consumers a lot. I think in the book there's probably 300 wines. On my website, there's probably 1,200 wines. I think it's important for consumers to know, to be able to choose wines they like to drink that are sustainable. I don't want anybody to say, oh, I bought this wine because it was sustainable, but I really didn't like it. So if it's Albarino or Malbec, I want it to be both tasty. And so we listed in the book wines that are by flavor profile and specific wines. But if you can't find that wine, the winery itself, all of their wines are going to
Mhm.
be sustainably produced or biodynamic or organic. So it's just a good direction for people who don't know what to drink or what to buy. But it's the winery itself that is certified, not the wine
Did you ever
specifically.
get feedback from a winemaker when you ask them a question that they say they can't tell you or they don't know? As an example, I've asked winemakers, is this vegan? And they'll say, on that vintage, I can't remember if I did this to it or that to it. Have
Yeah,
you ever
I
come across that?
No, I've never come across one where they say they're vegan and they don't know. Because, I mean, vegan really is primarily in how they filter the wines.
Mhm.
There's nothing, when you think about winemaking, there's very little about the winemaking process that would involve animal products. But they call it fining, but really it's filtering. When they filter, you pick the grapes, you ferment the grapes, you've got all kinds of stuff. Let's put it that way, skins and pulp and juice. And then you basically filter the wine. So you filter out some of that. And in many regions, they use egg yolk to do that. And eggs are not vegan. So there just are not that many ways to produce a wine that is not vegan. So I've never had anybody say to me, no, I don't know if it's vegan because, I think they always produce in Bordeaux, for example. I don't know if you've been to Bordeaux, there's actually a little dessert product that you buy that's made from egg whites. And there's everywhere, all over Bordeaux, because that's what's left over from the egg yolks, and they use that to make this sweet little thing. It's almost a cake, but but I don't know that it's in the fining process where a wine is vegan or not.
I think they were just questioning. They couldn't remember if they put milk powder in to clarify or not. So weird things. My last geeky question to you, Sandra, is
Okay.
this, and it has to do with, you mentioned vegan, and in the biodynamic world, there's a process of putting the cow horns and manure in the vineyard.
Yes.
I've heard talk that a true vegan will not drink biodynamic wines because of the animal product touching.
Yeah.
Have you heard that? Is that a
I
true
have.
thing?
Yes, I have. Because it's a critical part of what is biodynamic is placing they put manure really in the horn of a lactating cow. They bury it at a certain time. They take a goat's bladder and they put certain natural products in the goat's bladder and hang it on a tree for X amount of time. It sounds very strange, but the wine itself tends to be very superb, biodynamic wine. But yeah, so that would not, I don't think most biodynamic wines would not qualify as vegan. And many wineries nowadays actually buy the preparations already made. So they're not actually doing that themselves, but that is how those preparations are produced. So yeah, they would come in contact with animal products.
Just another strange thing in the wine world.
Yeah, it
Right.
is very strange. But the largest number of wine that are biodynamic in the world are in the United States, surprisingly. And I've been to conferences where the biodynamic proponent will stand and explain this, and winemakers in the audience who've studied at UC Davis, who are really scientists, because the winemaking is a science. They're trying in their heads to figure out what happens in the ground when that horn of a lactating cow is buried beneath the earth for X number of weeks or months, and they come up with the scientific explanation for it. And the biodynamic person says, yes, but it attracted a certain amount of energy to it. And it really throws them because there's no scientific explanation. And
Scientists want the science.
Yeah, they
We
want
want to
the
know the
science.
why.
Yeah, but the wine is really outstanding. Most biodynamic. And a lot of a large number of biodynamic wineries are in Burgundy. Some of the most expensive wines in the world are biodynamic. So,
So much
go
good
figure.
information. It's so much in the book that we had no time to cover. You talk about more about biodynamics, regenerative organic certification. So many different things are in the book, not to mention a good selection of wines for people to find and experiment with this sustainability practice. So, Sandra, thank you so much for the book and your passion for this and for bringing it to our listeners and talking to Kim and I today. We really appreciate it. And I hope our listeners go out and get this book, Vines and Values,
Yeah.
A Consumer's Guide to Sustainable Wine, Savoring Wines You Need to Know. Great
Thank
book.
you.
Yes. Thank you for untangling so many of these topics that I think are really difficult for consumers to sometimes wrap their heads around. They have a hard enough time figuring out what the wine label is trying to tell them to begin with, and then adding all of this other stuff can be a little bit more confusing as well. But you have a way with words making it just that much more understandable. So thank you very much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to us today on the wonderful world of wine. We have been your hosts, Mark Lenzi and Kim Simone, with our special guest today, Sandra Taylor. You can find more information about Sandra on her website, sandraetaylor.com, and more information about us at our website, thewww.wine. You can find us on social media at The Wonderful World of Wine, and we are supported by Franklin Public Radio. Cheers!
Cheers!